Now, being curious uh, is perhaps a trait that is quite important if you really want to express empathy. And it is a lot more complicated than it seems. On one end, okay, you truly don't understand something at all. It's their reality, it's not your experience. But on the other end, you think you know everything about it. Perhaps you've had some experience about it yourself, and maybe you're just trying to ask questions to validate certain things or test your hypothesis. Now, the problem with just the latter right now is that you're probably not curious. You're making it as if it's some sort of an academic exercise. Okay? You're making your counterpart, your friend, the other party, as if he or she is some sort of a lab rat. Okay? And in those cases, you've already made up your mind, and and you're not being open anymore to the conversation. It's as if we're trying to lead the witness, if this were like a courtroom case, pretty much fueling our own confirmation bias. You just wanted to find out, okay, I have this theory. I think I know this is it. I just wanted to find out, really confirm it if that's the case. But you're not being curious. Now, the best way to make sure that your curiosity is authentic and you are genuinely concerned about the other person is to hold that mindset that in spite of how good you are in reading other people, okay, you don't actually know what's going on for them. And that's a reality. You don't really know. Okay. Uh, and it's important that you keep that sense of openness, sometimes being naive in a certain way. I mean, not really dumb, but being genuinely open and innocent about these things. And with this naive curiosity, if you may, you're more likely to use questions that encourage disclosure. So now you can see the connection with empathy, curiosity, which leads to eventual disclosure, right? So, curiosity, the best form or the best way to actually express that curiosity is by asking questions. But there's a trick to it, there's an art to it. Not all questions are created equal. And asking the right kind can help encourage someone to share. Now, examples would be like open ended questions. They widen the scope of the conversation by generating options, perspectives that are different, or perhaps new ways of thinking about a particular situation. Now, the most effective open ended questions don't begin with the word why. They just don't. I mean, why? Uh, and sort of feels judgmental at the start. Uh, and why questions tend to drive people into their heads and out of their feelings. You you're trying to invalidate or to be dismissive of whatever emotions they're feeling, which is not necessarily correct or appropriate. Okay? Such questions also carry an implicit request that the other person should justify themselves. You're telling the other person, hey, prove why this is the case, or prove why you're feeling this way, uh, which again leads to a judgmental mindset. Okay. Now, close-ended questions, which are typically answered by yes or no, okay, pretty much binary, they can narrow the conversation, and it doesn't really make your disclosures rich. Maybe it won't even encourage disclosures because certain closed-ended questions can just be factual in nature. Okay. Now, both close-ended questions or questions that are rhetorical in nature, right? Or what you call pseudo questions, they form something of like, as I mentioned, like you're testing that if the other person is some lab rat, right? And that's not how the other person would want to feel. Okay. In the same way, the other person may or may not welcome advice. And it's one thing to really acknowledge what the other person is feeling, really trying to understand the perspective of your counterpart, it's another thing to go deep into advice giving. Okay? And advice is rarely useful in that situation. Okay? Even if the other person asks for it. Okay? Sometimes, maybe the other person is just being gracious. You're the type of person who really gives good advices, maybe. Okay? So he or she might be, in a way forced to lead the conversation as if he or she is asking for advice. Well, in certain situations, that's not always going to be useful or helpful. Okay? Uh, our eagerness to help often causes us to jump to a solution and therefore jump to conclusions. Uh, and when we jump to conclusions, we make assumptions. We sometimes don't hear or listen to the other person already because we really want to solve everything right away. Okay? So rarely do we come up with an option that the other person hasn't already considered. Okay? And that's usually not going to help. Also, giving advice can also increase the disparity of power or influence between the both of you. Okay, the person with an issue might feel sort of one down, a little bit inferior compared to you to start with. And if the other person acts if, well, let's say in your case, you're acting as if you have all of the answers, then that can actually widen the gap. It's not going to make a connection. Now, another problem with advice giving is that because we're jumping to conclusions, it's easy to misunderstand what the other really wants. Especially, okay, if they think this is what they really want, but we've never really went into a full dialogue on what really the problem might be. Okay, uh, and there are many reasons why people go to other people. Sometimes they just want to be heard. Sometimes they just want to feel validated. Okay? That they're alive, that they're human beings, that they're also capable of these emotions. Okay? Sometimes they just want to vent. Okay? Sometimes they just want support and empathy, okay, about an unfair situation. Okay? But oftentimes it's not about having a solution right away. So the listener needs to be clear about what the other person wants before they can fully understand how to be most helpful. Now, another thing about advice giving, it can keep you also from discovering what is really going on with the other person. You become close minded. Okay? And that's hard, uh, which is why we have to be careful when it comes to talking to other people. Okay? And they're disclosing certain things, and maybe they don't really want to hear any advices from you. Okay? Now, if you think about it, if advice is so useless, okay, who would want it? Why would we want to give advices still? Okay, well, perhaps because another person's issues seem so much easier to solve than our own. The grass is greener at the other side of the fence. We tend to have that situation. Or perhaps we feel that we want to exhibit our skills. We're very analytical as well. Okay? Or at times we might have this savior complex. We really want to save the proverbial damsel in distress. But whatever the reason, you have to ask yourself whenever you're talking to someone in a similar situation, am I giving advice to meet my needs or because I really want to help? Okay? In spite of all the reasons, advice can be problematic. There are times when it works. Okay? So it's not all bad. Don't think that we shouldn't do advice giving. The idea there is that we should know when to give advices. Okay? And there are certain conditions. If you're going to provide an advice to someone, you have to understand the situation fully. And before that, you need to double check and validate with the other person. Did you have the other situation pinned down correctly, completely, comprehensively, exhaustively? Okay? That you really know what the other wants and take their style and approach into account. Okay? And more importantly, you have to set aside what you would do. Okay? It's not about you, it's about them. And sometimes the best coaches, the best advice givers, normally they throw an open ended question to the other person. Now, given all these things that you've shared with me, what would you like to do? Sometimes the advice need not be a concrete measure to be done by the other person. It can be an invitation for them to have a sense of agency and initiative. And that's it. Maybe that's the advice that's necessary at that point. Okay. Furthermore, advice giving doesn't necessarily contribute much to knowing the other person. Okay, you're saying something out, but there's no input to actually hear from the other person. Okay, in that sense. So, other than learning their response to your suggestions, in helping another to be known, you want to look for opportunities to support them in more fully expressing their emotions. So, how do you know if they have understated their feelings? In a sense, you don't. You really can't tell exactly how they're feeling. Okay. Yeah, you know more or less the general category. I mean, if you're being empathetic with the other person, okay, you know the general area, but to be very precise about it, well, mathematically speaking, if that's possible, you don't, right? But you can make a guess based on the tone, based on the things that they've provided. Okay. Nonverbal cues also, their body language, noticing the intensity of the situation. These are cues that you can pick up and you can make an assessment more or less on how they're really feeling. Now, and lastly, okay, there's a fine line between reflecting back unstated or understated emotions and asking leading questions. Okay, so sometimes in the course of trying to understand the other person, we may probe a lot of things, especially emotions that we don't really understand fully. So maybe we can ask probing questions if we really can't understand how the other person is still feeling in spite of what the other person has said, or we're just probably asking leading questions. Maybe, again, we already have an hypothesis in mind. We just want to lead them along and test like lab rats. Okay. The difference between reflecting back on what might have been unstated or understated versus asking leading questions is that you have different assumptions. On the first case, unstated or understated emotions, you just don't know. Okay, you wanted to clarify. On the other hand, asking leading questions, you have an idea, you have an assumption of what that is. Okay? And that really spells a lot of difference. In the first case, if you're genuinely curious, okay, then you'll try to discover and get some idea on what the other person might be feeling. Okay, I mean that would hopefully lead you to more connections. But if you already are thinking about this is how they're feeling, that builds and adds to the judgmental character. In which case, it doesn't really help in building that connection. If you accept that you never know what is going on in another person, then you know you're just making a guess. And you can be honest about it. I'm just making a guess. I'm just inferring based on the data that's in front of me, based on what you have said. Okay. And it's just that, it's a supposition. Okay. And when you go through that process of admitting that you're just making a guess, it gives the other person some sort of power in a way. You're giving them that power and they feel good about it. Okay? In the sense that that gives them that signal that, hey, this person is not trying to put me down, or this person is not really thinking about satisfying unhealthy hypothesis in his or her head. Okay? And, if you are really disclosing that you really don't know what the other person is actually feeling, okay, or you might have some guesses, but you could be wrong, those empathetic statements are likely to encourage to express their feelings more fully.